Welcome to another episode of Dialogues with me, Richard Reeves. If bail decisions were made by an artificial intelligence instead of by human judges, the repeat crime rates among bail applicants could be cut by 25%. And the reason for that is because an AI is consistent in its judgments, whereas different judges are very inconsistent, or actually even the same judge can be inconsistent over time. So if you were standing in court trying to get bail, would you want the decision to be made by a human or by an AI? And this difference in bail decisions, as well as in things like judicial sentencing generally, lots of medical diagnoses, insurance underwriting, are all examples of what my guest today, Cass Sunstein, calls noise, defined as unwanted variations in professional judgments. And noise is the theme of his new book, called Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgement, which is co-authored with the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Danny Kahneman, as well as the business professor Olivier Sibony. So the theme here is that while professional judgment and discretion sound great in theory, especially, of course, to the professionals themselves, but in practice, it means that we end up facing a lottery in some pretty high-stakes situations, life and death situations, or liberty and freedom situations. Now, Cass is one of the right people to be writing about this. He's an expert in regulation. He's one of the most influential and prolific public intellectuals at work today. He's a professor at Harvard, author of dozens of books, probably most famously the 2008 book Nudge, which he co-authored with Richard Thaler. He ran the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the first Obama administration. And he's actually now working as a senior counsel at the Department of Homeland Security, where we're all hoping that he's going to fix the immigration system. In our conversation, we talk a lot about the law and how there's been this interesting history around noise in legal sentencing. There was a 2-decade period or so where the noise, i.e. the variation in sentencing, was really reduced after a law in 1984, which was then overturned for unrelated reasons by the Supreme Court. And so it was like a natural experiment in noise reduction, and then the return of noise, very considerable return in variation in sentencing since 2005. That's one reason why he thinks we should have statues of the legal reformer Marvin Franklin, who pioneered the 1980s changes across the nation. We talk about how to reduce the creep factor in AI decision-making, and how early movers or early influencers really shape public opinion, especially through social media, and plenty more besides. At the end, I try to find some disagreement between us on John Stuart Mill, his shared interest in liberalism, and come up largely empty-handed. Where we do end up agreeing very strongly is in the way that many conservative writers are creating a wildly straw man version of liberalism and Mill, in order then to kind of knock it down and declare the end of liberalism or failure of liberalism and so on. So all in all, it's a pretty wide-ranging conversation that gets into pretty big ethical as well as practical issues. And it left me just thinking about where the noise is in my own life and some of the institutions that I'm involved in, which I guess is the point. And it may well do the same for you. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Cass Sunstein, welcome to Dialogues.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, we have so much we could talk about. You've just co-authored what, by my count, is your millionth book. Or I don't know how many you're up to now, but 40 or something on noise. And we're really going to get into that. But I want to say, first of all, it's a great pleasure to speak to you somewhat more formally. We've met briefly, but I've followed your work with great interest. I was somewhat involved in setting up the Quotes Nudge unit with Dick Thaler, your co-author in the UK, and was in the Cameron government, followed your work on Mill. I hope we'll get a chance to turn to that. I want to spend our time talking mostly about this new book that you've co-authored on noise, A Flaw in Human Judgement, and then into some of the underlying questions about paternalism and nudging and so on too. So that's what I'm hoping that we'll do. I will say we're not going to talk about your kind of current role at all, but I do just want to say, if you could fix the immigration system, Cass, that would be great. That's all I'm going to say. You don't have to respond.
Thank you for that. We're trying.
Good. That's all I'll say on your kind of current job. But let's talk about noise. This new book. Actually, you have a number of relatively new books, but this one's so interesting because it's you and it's Danny Kahneman, who'll be known to many as having won the Nobel Prize and for his work with Amos Tversky on some of these heuristics and so on. And also Olivier Sibony, who's a management consultant, and then obviously you, co-author of Nudge, legal scholar by background, policy wonk, etc. Tell me a little bit about how that collaboration came about and how it's been working with such a diverse group of intellectuals.
Danny and I did a bunch of papers in the 1990s on jury behavior. And it turns out a lot of the work was on noise, about how different juries come up with very erratic judgments. And we tried to understand that. After he published Thinking Fast and Slow, since he's a very good friend, I would get to see him periodically and ask him what he was working on. And in one of the discussions, he said he has a big idea, he thinks it's a large one. And he described it about noise. And I said, what's going to come of it? And he said, well, we have an article brewing. I don't think much else, but I'm very excited about it. Then I saw him about a year later, and he said he was working with a brilliant French academic, Olivier Sibony, on the topic. And I said, that's very exciting. And he said, absolutely. He said, we've written a lot. I don't know if anything's going to come of it, but we're certainly having fun. Then maybe a year or two later, I asked him how it was coming, and he said, well, we're still having fun. I don't think anything's going to come of it. But he had a twinkle in the eye and a sense of excitement that made me feel sad that he wasn't clear that he was going to have a book. So eventually I said, can I have lunch and we can talk about it? And the three of us had lunch together, and we did. And after the lunch, I remember thinking that it would be very exciting, though daunting, to join them. We spent maybe 2 or 3 hours discussing the topic and policy and law applications. But it was a little like in high school, you don't ask the most beautiful girl to date you, you wait till she shows some interest. So I was a little feeling like this would be a day of staring at my cell phone, seeing if he might have the same thought. And the next day he asked, would you join? And that was not a hard question. And I think I answered in approximately 1 second.
So it was an intellectual flirtation where you then waited to see if Danny would call you.
Yes, it was their project.
It's turned out very well. And obviously the overlaps are obvious, and I can totally see why the team would have worked so well. It does lead to some interesting bits where, of course, if you know particularly if you know yours and Danny's work, you spend a little bit of time thinking, that feels like Cass. And that's clearly Olivier, because it's this whole discussion of internal management consulting, because he was at McKinsey before, right? And then some of this is Danny. But as it weaves together, it's super interesting, very, very ambitious. I want to start just by getting let's just start with getting the concepts right, because there are a number of different concepts at work here. So this idea of noise to start with, and the kind of variation you get when different people make different judgments. I don't think this is in the book, but you talked about this somewhere, where you've actually done this with your own spouse, where you've ranked your friends on different characteristics. You've done it separately and then joined each other. I must say, given that your spouse, and I don't think this is a secret, Samantha Power, who currently runs USAID, I'd love to know if you want to share any of the results about any of your own friends. That would be great. I bet you won't name anybody, but
so I actually don't remember if this made it into the final version of the book. I hope so. But we discussed, the three of us, a little exercise in which you rank friends in terms of diligence, kindness, let's say.
That's right. You did. The authors did it. We didn't get the spousal versions, but yes.
Yeah. So you say, how kind is a friend? How diligent is a friend? And let's say, how smart is a friend? And we expected that there would be noise, and that would be interesting, and maybe a universe in a grain of sand. So I did this with my wife, Samantha, about 3 of our greatest friends. I think I won't name the friends, but our rankings were very, very different. She would sometimes say that person's a 3 with respect to kindness, and I would say that person's a 5 with respect to kindness. And we would sometimes differ only because we use the scale differently, where she would think a 4 was very good, and I would think a 4 was pretty good. Or we differ because we had a different conception of that person. And that was a clue about the different kinds of noise.
Yes, and in fact, this issue about how people treat scales does come up quite significantly. And those are great examples, and you have other examples about how some bathroom scales can be kind of one way or the other. And so you've got this variation. There's a very important distinction between noise and bias. And so maybe using your bathroom scales example or any other example, kind of just explain why noise is not just bias.
Okay, so you can imagine a scale which has you always a little heavier than you actually are. So it is biased in the direction of seeing you as heavy. It's an unkind scale. Mm-hmm. Now, that scale would be biased. If there's a firm, let's say, that hires men over women, that's a systemic bias. A bias would be a deviation from accuracy in a predictable direction. You could imagine people are just unrealistically optimistic about their plans, kind of always. That's bias. And bias has a kind of charisma and excitement associated with it. I think that's what we've seen over the last 30 years. A lot of people thinking bias, oh my gosh, that's a problem and we can solve it. A noisy scale would be one that shows you as a little heavier than you are on Monday and Tuesday, and a little lighter than you actually are on Wednesday and Thursday. A noisy firm would be one where half of the people, let's say, hire men over women and half of them hire women over men. And it might be that on average, there's no sex inequality in terms of who's hired, but there's a lot of noise. You could imagine a person rating people, to go back to our first, in terms of kindness, is just very severe about kindness, and no one gets above a 3 on a 0 to 5 scale. Or you could imagine someone who's very surprised by kindness on the part of anyone, anytime, and gives everyone a 4 or 5. And that would be noise across those two people. We would have two biases, let's say, with respect to evaluation, and it would produce noise across people. And our view is that noise is all over the place, that wherever there's judgment, there's noise and more than you think, and that the enthusiasm for investigating bias in a way has crowded out or crushed potential interest in the topic of noise, which is as interesting and which can be a kind of silent killer with respect to avoiding mistakes.
And in many ways as unfair, because there's an arbitrariness to noise. And that makes it harder to get at in some ways than bias. You know, if you can see, okay, it's systematically, they're not hiring women, they're shooting to the left, it's 5 pounds under, then you can sort of see a problem and maybe think about correcting it. Whereas when it's scattered in that way, it may not feel like such a big problem, but as the person who is at the end of that decision, the very arbitrariness of it is just a different kind of unfairness.
A violation of equal treatment. So what we find is there are lotteries everywhere. Mm-hmm. And often with respect to important things, the most important moment is when someone is assigned to make the resolution. If it's A, Andy, who's assigned, the resolution would be different from if it's B, Barbara, who's assigned. And that's really unfair. If we're talking about, let's say, whether you get hired, whether you get promoted, whether you get a long jail sentence, whether you get treated well or not so well by a company with whom you have a complaint.
Yes, I'm going to dig into some of these examples. You cover a huge number in the book, actually, but there's a kind of further tightening of these definitions as we go here. So the next thing is to focus on, and you're very specific in the book, unwanted variation in professional judgment. So now we're moving to a different space. It probably doesn't really matter. It's not a professional judgment that you and Samantha are making about your friends. It's a purely personal one. And it may also not be unwanted. It might make life a bit more interesting that you have different views. It doesn't matter in the sense, but then you focus in on these, and you've already begun to do this, where it's matters of life and death or freedom and liberty. It's a medical decision. You actually mentioned asylum. The refugee roulette paper you refer to, where the chances of getting granted asylum status vary massively depending on which judge you end up in front of. So these are professional judgments, pretty high stakes, and I think it's because they're quite high stakes that we don't want the variation, that it's an unwanted variation, so you have legal sentencing, etc. Is that a fair characterization of the main concern? And could you talk a bit more about the legal case, maybe?
So the book focuses on professional judgments, and I say that with a smile because people tend not to start jumping up and down and cheering when they think there's a book about professional judgments. They might think that it's relevant to a lot of stuff, but how much fun can it be? And let me explain why the focus on professional judgments, but why, in my view at least, the implications are broader. So if you have an organization, let's say, that's deciding how to handle a problem that comes up repeatedly, let's say how to deal with a dissatisfied employee or a misbehaving employee. It might be that the firm is noisy in the sense that half of those misbehaving or dissatisfied employees get one kind of response and half get another kind of response. Now, we focused on unfairness, and that's really important to focus on, but it may also mean there's a lot of error. So if the firm is noisy like the scale, and we think of the human mind as a measuring instrument like a scale, it might be that half of the misbehaving employees are treated much too harshly. They should get a slap on the wrist and be told to do better. And half are treated much too harshly. That's the half that's treated much too leniently. And they should get at least a slap on the wrist, but they're told, human beings make mistakes and don't do it again. Not even a slap on the wrist. So we can see with respect to many professional judgments, not only unfairness, but error, and the errors compound. So it took me as third author a while to get this through my mind in a way that I think was productive for the book, because we tend to think that errors cancel out. And if in professional judgments, half of the night they do one thing, half the time they do other thing, they're noisy, sure, but there's no error systematically in one direction. We tend to think that that's okay, the average is okay, but it really isn't okay. It's the errors aggregate. So if you have a doctor who overdiagnoses, let's say, cancer, and meaning puts you through a whole battery of tests and when they're really not indicated, and another doctor underdiagnoses cancer, so you get really sick or die, that noise adds up. It's like the scale. Okay, so that's professional judgment. But the implications extend to daily life. So I'll just give one example. A form of noise, one reason for noise, is mood really matters to judgment. So if you're very happy, you might think, let's go forward with something. And if you're really sad or scared, that's just your mood. That has nothing to do with the judgment. It's because, let's say, COVID is afoot in your area, or because someone in your family had a setback, so you're scared or sad. You might think, no, I'm not going to go forward. And that's about life generally. We call it occasion noise, where within the person, judgments can be highly variable, depending on whether your favorite sports team won the day before.
Yes, you have great examples of that. There's these famous studies showing that you get a more lenient sentence if the local team won. So there's this intrapersonal noise, and then there's this system noise that you make a big distinction between. And I think you're more focused on system noise in this book. I'd say the intra is a bit more consistent with the previous work, maybe that Danny's done and that you've done, which tends to focus on the individual rather than the system. It's
completely right that the main focus of the book on system is system noise, but we have a fair bit to say about occasion noise. And actually, in Danny's work and mine, we hadn't focused on that. Both of us focused on bias. He did the foundational work. I did much more applied work. But it's not about noise within the person. And to see that as an ingredient of mistake.
Yes, okay. So there's the noise within the person. And if that person is making an important decision, like whether to send me to jail or not, then that's clearly a concern. Then you add up all those individuals, you end up with this kind of system noise and this massive variation. I really like the example that you treat at length of Marvin Franklin and his work on the variation in sentencing, which led to the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, which introduced some mandatory guidelines around sentencing that significantly reduced noise. The Supreme Court reversed that in 2005. The judges were thrilled because they got to be judges again. I mean, that's how they would see it. but variation massively rose again. So after the Supreme Court took the guidelines away, the variation between the average sentence and the harshest sentence went from about 2.8 to twice that. And so doubling in the variation between the average and the top as a result of it, because the judges are thrilled. So there's this that's a great story in terms of system noise as a result of all the factors you just talked about, introduction of some, what you would call a noise reduction strategy as a result of Frankel and others' noise audit. Okay, you got to stick within these guidelines. Sorry, we're reducing your discretion. Reduction in noise, professional rebellion, Supreme Court comes to the rescue, noise again. Is that a fair summary of that? And then where do you go from here?
Yes. So we added the story of sentencing guidelines and Marvin Frankel to the beginning of the book, relatively late in the process of writing the book. And we joke that we want statues of Marvin Frankel to be erected in many cities all over the globe. And the story is fascinating. That Marvin Frankel did informal noise audits, as we call them, meaning he just investigated behavior and found that for one offense, call it shoplifting, the same person could be either subject to probation, go home, or a lengthy jail sentence. And the existence of noise in the criminal justice system, Marvin Frankel, this very spirited federal judge, thought was an outrage, a scandal. He was also interested in bias, but his main focus was on noise, a violation of equal treatment that he thought was a horror. This was all before Stephen King, but Stephen King is sufficiently imaginative that he could insert it into a chapter in a horror novel. Okay, then the upshot of his heroic work was that our Congress got to trying to remedy it with guidelines. And the basic idea was try to reduce the unequal treatment, try to reduce the bias, and also try to reduce the error by having some sort of systematicity so that you have a guideline which isn't tightly constraining, but would at least reduce the volume of the noise. And this was regarded by many people as a fantastic step forward in terms of equality and avoiding excessive leniency, but also in some cases avoiding excessive severity. The federal judges despised it. They thought that, look, they want to engage in individualized judgment given their understanding of the offender and the offense. The fact that their hands were tied was to them an outrage of its own. And this is a very interesting disagreement among people of good faith and keen intelligence. We tend to side with the sentencing guidelines. The Supreme Court struck down the guidelines, not on the ground that they were too constraining, but on a different ground, not relevant here.
Yeah, it was a technicality, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well, it had to do with jury trials, so it was a big issue, but it's not the noise issue in particular. And the evidence shows that you got a ton of noise afterwards, that the inequality exploded after the sentencing guidelines were eliminated. Political differences between Republicans and Democrats started becoming bigger than they were. All of the things that outraged Frankel, at least to some degree, have rematerialized. And that's very not good, let's say. Mm-hmm. What to do about it? There's a reform project there. It might be that there's something to be done that doesn't defend the jury trial right, which is what the Supreme Court invoked, that presses judges in the direction of greater uniformity among similarly situated people. You have someone who's did one thing that's really horrible and someone who did one thing that's not so horrible. Of course, that's a legitimate difference.
Yes, and so you're trying to reduce the variation here rather than expunge it altogether. And there are obviously other examples. We'll perhaps get on to the role of kind of AI in just a moment and how far you can turn these things kind of mechanized. But it's a great. Actually, let's do that now because you've mentioned Stephen King, so why not go down this kind of route? So one view of your reading of this is, look, once you have enough data, then you can just let a machine do it. actually, maybe bail would be a better way of getting into this, because you have this great example of the variation in bail and who gets bail. And actually, this is Sendell Muller-Nathan's work, I think, that you refer to, and it put an AI onto it, gave them 750,000 cases, gave the AI 750,000 cases, said, you decide bail with all the same data. And the AI managed to reduce crime significantly. I was actually astonished by how many people reduced on bail recommit. I mean, that's my ignorance, but of the people who get released, 74% were released on bail, 15 didn't turn up for the court case, 26% were rearrested in the meantime. So I had no idea the recidivism rates on bail were so high. It made me feel quite conservative about bail, I'll be honest. But the AI said, no, let me do it. And it reduced that recidivism rate by 24%, or put the other way around, it could reduce the number of detainees by 42% over and above the federal gun. So that's bail rather than sentencing. But I think the principle applies, which is that AI did a really terrifically good job. And so the judges might see these guidelines as just one step towards, ultimately, you just walk into the court, it gets the demographics. And then in a different Stephen King novel, the scandal is not that you are arbitrarily at the mercy of the judge. I mean, Rousseau has this great phrase of living at the mercy of others, but you are instead just treated like a number, and a machine just spits out your sentence is, or your bail is denied, and it's not a human. And so those are great examples of how far this could go, right? And why shouldn't they go that far?
Okay, great. If we may, let's sneak up on that. The idea of decision by algorithm or artificial intelligence makes a lot of people feel creeped out or outraged, and that's an understandable reaction, and sometimes it's right, not merely understandable. But to fix intuitions, I'd love to sneak up on the problem. Okay, so first, you could have a system that says whether you're allowed to vote or to drink depends on the individualized discretion of the official. Okay, so the official could say not, how old are you, but could say instead, what do I think of you and your capacity to vote? So on that view, some 12-year-olds could vote. I have a 12-year-old son. He knows a lot. Maybe he could vote. And on that view, maybe some 40-year-olds couldn't vote. I think no one would want that. We have rules for who gets to vote that aren't very noisy, except if things screw up. And noise in the voting eligibility, that's a scandal, and we have some of that. But the basic idea is if you have a certain age, you can vote and then there are some specific unlesses. Okay, we could say that whether you get to drink depends on the individualized judgment of the bartender or something, or the state. And there's some of that. If you had too much, the bartender might say, I'm not going to serve you anymore. But we don't have individualized licensing schemes for whether you get to have beer. And that's good. We have rules. They're not algorithms in the sense of computers are involved, but they're rules. Now let's jump to one example, and then I'll get to yours. One other example. When infants are born in many nations, there's something called an APGAR score, where the medical personnel, doctor, nurse, scores the infant on 5 dimensions on a very limited scale and adds up the numbers, and that tells you whether the infant is in good health. We don't have the nurse or the doctor saying, how healthy do I think the little one is? And that's very good that we have something that's much more rule-bound. It has dramatically reduced noise and bias and error, and it's extremely positive.
Let's pause there because we will come back to AI. You're right, I was running ahead a little bit, but this APGAR one is a great example, partly because personally for me, when I can remember my kids' APGAR scores, but I have no idea what they meant. But it was a big deal that they got an APGAR score. And why the reason it's such a good example is I think it speaks a bit to some of the noise reduction or noise hygiene, as you refer to it, in a really nice way. It does a couple of things, it seems to me. First of all, it decomposes it. And you talk quite a lot about this, rather than just, is this baby okay or not? It's actually, okay, here are the different things you should listen out for. Is the baby crying? Is it responding? What color is it? And so on. And then it has like 3-point scales. So it's just baby silent, crying but not very loud, or good, healthy cry or something. I'm not remembering exact words. And again, you might say, well, that's pretty subjective. But what it's done is it's forced the medical professionals, first of all, okay, here are the things I need to look at. And then roughly what are the scales that I should be listening for? Yeah, you'll get some variation, what counts as a loud cry, but roughly speaking. And so it hasn't got you to this kind of algorithmic perfection, but it has done two things. It's decomposed the professional judgment, and it's provided some kind of scale. And that seems to be enough for that purpose.
Yeah, it's more rule-like. So I'm trying to reduce the creep factor of algorithms and artificial intelligence by giving the voting and the liquor eligibility examples, and then the APGAR score. And we have things like the APGAR score in multiple domains, whether you've got Social Security disability benefits in the United States isn't, do I think you're disabled enough? It's like a rule. It's in between a rule and a guideline. Okay, now let's get to algorithms. Algorithms are a little like the APGAR score or the voting eligibility with real discipline. So in the context you give, the question is, do we rely on or get advised by an algorithm with respect to whether someone should get bail? And the reason a judge would give bail is that there's a minimal flight risk, and a flight risk, it turns out, is associated with criminal behavior. The data shows, a very large data set by Sendhil Mullainathan and his collaborators, shows that I'm going to be, as an English major, I'm going to be qualitative rather than quantitative here. Mm-hmm. It shows that if you rely on the algorithm rather than a judge, you can keep the same number of people in prison as are now in prison and massively reduce crime. That's very positive. Or if you're not that excited about that, you can have the same level of crime and massively reduce the number of people in prison. And if you want to adjust along both margins and have some reduction in crime, some reduction in prison populations, tell the algorithm to do that. And it can. And it's going to outperform the judges like crazy. Now, why is the algorithm so much better than the judges? There are two reasons. One is judges show an identifiable bias. There are multiple ones, but the most relevant for current purposes is current offense bias. The judge overweights compared to the algorithm what the offender just did. So if the offender did something light, like shoplifting, the judge is more likely to say, bail. The algorithm will look at a lot of details, like how many other things did that person do in the last 10 years, and will not overweight the current offense. And the current offense bias is like availability bias in behavioral science more broadly. The other thing is judges are very noisy. They show a lot of variability. The algorithm has no noise, and that is a significant contributor to its spectacular achievement.
The introduction of noiselessness as one of the advantages of rule-based systems and so on, as opposed to or in addition to the reduction in bias, I think is huge. In some ways, a kind of one of the central insights of the whole book. And I agree that obviously there's a sort of creepiness factor more generally around all this. But one of the positive aspects of the debate about algorithms, and I think you refer to the Compass one that's seen as racially biased and so on, is that it makes, I think you say this in the book, it makes it transparent. It means that you're actually having an argument about what should and shouldn't go into the algorithm. And if a bias appears, go, oh, why is that? And you can investigate it. And so it sort of brings into the harsh light of day the contours of the judgment in a way that if it just remains within the opaque mind of thousands of judges, you never know. I don't know what your algorithm is, Cass, and you don't know what mine is. And so we'll never know. And because they're all different, you get these noise effects. Whereas if we say, even just as a thought experiment, saying, let's have an algorithm for bail. Like if you end up not doing that, just it flushes out all these issues that otherwise remain buried in the sort of gray matter of the judges. And I actually quite appreciate that transparency of the debate, even if I don't know where it ends up.
Completely. Thank you for that. So it's often said that algorithms are a black box and not transparent. And along some dimensions, that might be true. We might want to have a Bill of Rights for algorithmic regulation, which would require transparency. But if you have an algorithm that ends up, let's say, treating women and men differently, we can see that. And we can see maybe why. Mm-hmm. And if it's not on the surface of it, why? We have a detective story where we might be able to find out who the killer is. So you might find out that men are being treated differently from women by the algorithm because, let's say, height is part of what the algorithm is paying attention to. And that should be on the surface of the algorithm. If it isn't on the surface of the algorithm, it might be height is correlated with some other thing that the algorithm is caring about. And that allows potentially much more access to the source of discrimination than you can get if you have human beings who say, I'm not a discriminator. And there's a profound point you're making, which is that when we see problems with algorithms, one problem might be rigidity, another might be indifference to considerations that should matter. A third problem might be some sort of demonstrated bias amidst the noiselessness. We can interrogate what's going on in the algorithm and understand something about our practices that we might not understand if we just had 1,000 human beings, each of whom denies that they're a discriminator.
Yes, and I think that that's the flushing out of these normative issues or the making transparent of them so that you have to justify them in plain light of day or not is important because, of course, discrimination is now a word that we think of as only a bad thing. But if you charge young men more for car insurance than young women, which insurers do, as it happens, that's because they're actuaries, and it may not be an AI. It probably is an AI now, I'm sure, but previously it would just be an actuary with lots of tables. Have discovered that's because young men are more likely to crash their cars, right? And so you might say, well, are you discriminating against young men? And the insurer would say, yes, we are, because they're more likely to crash their cars. Now, of course, it gets more difficult when you introduce race and various other issues, but at the very least, you're not sort of waving away the fact that there might be some difficult issues here, like should car insurers discriminate against men?
You're right. In a democracy, what you're describing, or a non-democracy, it's very important. So a less inflammatory case would be, let's suppose an algorithm charges older people more for insurance than younger people. Let's say human beings aren't involved. The algorithm decides that older people are more likely to be in car crashes. And let's suppose it's urged that that's a form of discrimination. We would learn that if we didn't charge them more, we might be, on certain assumptions about the facts, defying actual risks. And if we defy actual risks, we might learn something about the economic consequences of not discriminating against older people. And as you say, discrimination of certain kinds, like if someone has been in 20 car crashes in the last 2 years, their rates might be higher than if they were involved in zero. That's discrimination against those involved in lots of car crashes, and that's probably not invidious. And in harder cases where something is correlated with something, we'd ask, is it invidious? And we'd have the relevant considerations on the table rather than hand-waving by both sides.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I want to turn now to go back a little bit to the issue of juries, which you mentioned earlier, and another kind of introduction of noiselessness. So you get a lot of noise in groups, such as juries. There's lots of other examples we could choose, but juries is a good one because we're in this legal space now. Let's imagine that the sentencing has been somewhat reduced in terms of its noise through the introduction of, the reintroduction of guidelines to start with, right? We're a long way from it being an AI. But you've still got the jury deciding, and it seems as if the evidence is quite strong that we influence each other so strongly that you actually don't get wisdom of crowds when the crowd's talking to each other. And so the wisdom of crowds requires the crowds to be silent and the jurors to be kept apart from each other. Is that right?
Yes. So I served on a jury once in my life, and it was hilarious that I didn't want to serve on a jury because I was really busy. There was a terrible 2-week period. And I said that I am a law professor and I study jury behavior. This is a number of years ago. And I was sure that I'd be bumped from the jury saying that. It was truthful. And I wasn't sad that I'd be bumped from the jury. I was kept on the jury and I served. And I was told later by the prosecutor that the prosecutor tried to bump me, but the judge insisted I be on, saying that I learned something. I'm not sure that's appropriate for the judge.
So it was used as a learning opportunity for you. But also, I love the fact you're honest about the fact you didn't want to serve, because the truth is everybody wants to be tried by jury, but no one wants to serve on a jury, or very few. It's one of those specific problems.
It was a very tough period given work commitments, but I did it. And to your point, they wanted me to be the foreman, my fellow jurors, and I declined. And the reason was I was a law professor, and I thought I should shut up because I'm going to have outsized influence on the group. And I certainly shouldn't be the foreperson, because if I was, my role would produce outsized influence. So I tried to be really, really quiet. It was a factual question on which I had no particular expertise. And the question was, how can we aggregate our diverse judgments? So let's start with a company's decision about to go forward with some project and then get to a jury. You should imagine any group's decision as producing one of a cloud of possibilities. So I was in the White House when President Obama decided to go after Osama bin Laden. He made that decision. That is a singular decision, but meaning it's not repeated, not the particular, at least. And that what happened was one of a cloud of possibilities. Science fiction writers are very good at putting a spotlight on the cloud of possibilities. If the product, go forward with a project decision, might go one way because the leader of the company says, I think it's a really good idea early on. And then let's say a deferential person or a cowardly person says, I agree with the boss. And then a third person might say, I agree with the boss and the coward. They wouldn't put it quite that way. And now we have a cascade developing in favor of going forward. That might be an unnecessary and might be a bad outcome. It might be that if the leader of the company had said, I'm not sure really, what do you all think? And I really want your independent judgments, a lot would emerge that would suggest the project's a bad idea. And that would be a different outcome, and by hypothesis, a preferable one. Or a third one, the company might turn to, let's say, the most trusted lieutenant and say, what do you think? And if that person says, I think the project is a terrible idea, that might initiate a cascade, the opposite of the first scenario. Now, juries are exactly the same. If you don't elicit the independent views of members, it can be the outcome is determined by the most confident or earliest or seemingly most expert speaker. And that ensures a failure, which is a failure to elicit the information the group has. So groups are noisy in the sense that one group can come to a result that is radically different from other groups which are identical except for something in the social dynamics. And the work I did with Danny Kahneman in the 1990s on punitive damage awards found extremely high levels of noise in juries.
It's very interesting, there's this influence of effect. And actually the famous example from Wisdom of Crowds is this kind of guess the weight of the cow thing from that English kind of village. And what's always forgotten about that, and people did very well, but they didn't see each other's guesses. Whereas here you've got, they're totally independent. Here you've got this dynamic where people affect each other. And you refer to, you don't name the website, but it's a very well-known website, social media, where people upvote and downvote people's comments. So it doesn't probably take too much work to figure out who you're probably talking about. But it's extraordinary how an early I mean, I'm thinking about this. I've got a new podcast, right? So I'm thinking about how many 5 stars I'm getting on kind of Apple right now as I'm reading this. And I'm like, God, I hope the first ones are good, because you find this extraordinary effect from the early mover influence. It's not just the strength of the influence, it's the earliness of the influence, right?
Yeah, there's amazing data on this. And I'll give a few. An early upvote, artificially generated by an experimenter, can make a comment super popular after large numbers of seemingly independent votes. So if an initial, this is great, can drive an outcome, that's one. Another is a study of the wisdom of crowds, which demonstrates your point, which is that crowds can be wise in making numerical estimates, like the weight of an animal. But if people are listening to one another, the wisdom of crowds is greatly diminished. It's a counterintuitive result, but it's because of the importance of eliciting independent judgments that's crucial to the wisdom of crowds effects. And there's a big lesson in that for companies and governments and organizations of all kinds. My very favorite of these studies is done by Duncan Watts and his collaborators. I think it's a profound study. And it shows that if on a music site, which has many thousands of visitors, you let people know what is getting early downloads on the music site, a song can do spectacularly well or flop compared to a control in which they don't see what other people are downloading. And the reason is the same song in one world of visitors can flop and another do spectacularly well, is just the enthusiasm, the serendipitous enthusiasm or lack of enthusiasm of early downloaders. Now, the reason I think that's profound is the success of President Trump, the success of President Obama, the success of various ideas, the success of various products is best explained in part by reference to cascade effects, that early people or people at exactly the right time started creating a snowball which got bigger and bigger and bigger. And that suggests we often think in hindsight it was inevitable that Taylor Swift would be generally regarded as amazing. But though she is amazing, there are other people, admittedly not quite amazing as she, but definitely amazing, about whom we've never heard because they didn't get the benefit of the equivalent of early downloads.
Yes, and that also highlights the point you've made here and elsewhere in your work about how retrospectively we all drift towards causal thinking. It was obvious Taylor Swift was going to do well, and we tell a kind of retrospective story about that. But I think it's powerful, especially in the context of social media. I think one of the challenges of social media ecosystems is that they make these cascades stronger and faster. And your previous work on social norms and norm cascades, I think, speaks more generally. But the upvote thing, the downloads, it's instantly visible, it's instantly communicated, and social media. Well, I'm going to say this as a statement, see if you agree with it. I think that social media has taken that early mover influence and just amplified it massively and accelerated it massively. Is that fair?
Completely. And because history is run only once, we don't see the role of serendipity and early movers in generating important outcomes. So this is one reason the world is much noisier than is apparent, because the cloud of possibilities that only one of which materialized, the others are just not visible, except if some historian or science fiction writer captures it.
Do you think that on balance, the world is getting noisier? I mean, I think in the long run, I don't think you touched this on the book, and it's just occurred to me now, but over the centuries, probably argue it's gotten less noisy. Like we have laws and administrative law, which you've written a lot about, and so on. So I think on the long run of history, you'd probably say we're less noisy today than we were in the 17th century, probably, or even the 19th century. But I'm not sure we're less noisy in 2021 than we were in 81.
I learned from co-author Kahneman always to see such questions as testable hypotheses, which would need to be tested, And so I'm agnostic on the answer to whether we're noisier now than we were. I'm not even sure what the precise version of the hypothesis is. If the question is what, is the criminal justice system noisier now than it was in the 1800s? That's in the nature of a testable hypothesis, and we'd need some data.
Would be interesting. An interesting subject, but I suspect getting the data for that would be pretty difficult. Well, let's just, I want to turn in a moment to paternalism more broadly, and perhaps we can get into Mill, but there is I just want to point out, there's a whole series of solutions outlined in the book, from a noise audit, which is effectively kind of look at how much variability is there, how much of that is unwanted, having someone who's like a decision officer who's just thinking about the way that decisions are made. And then there's a whole taxonomy or a suite of different approaches. You could have rules, you could have guidelines, you could have standards, you could subject some of it to an automatic kind of AI, depending on the context and so on. So there's a whole range of tools you could use, but the key thing is to just start by thinking about it, right? You talk about decision hygiene, like washing your hands. Just go look for the noise, accept that noise is there. That's probably the biggest message, right? Is just go have a look, and then you can fit the solution depending on how big the problem is.
Yes. So whether you are a little company or a big company or a university engaged in hiring or a government, you can do a noise audit by which you either look at actual decision making and get clarity that the most important choice is who makes the decision rather than the circumstances and the person about whom the decision is made. If you know that, you know you have a noise problem. A noise audit, we have an appendix on how to do it. You give a bunch of people a scenario or a bunch of scenarios and see how similar they are or how much variation there is. Chances are there will be more variation than is anticipated. Wherever we've done it so far, that's what we find. Then if you see a high volume of noise, probably you're going to be alarmed at the inequality and error that the volume of noise uncovers. It's like a scale that shows you as much heavier and much lighter than you are, depending on the day it is. You want to fix that scale. And there are things you can do that will work in reducing noise. If you aggregate independent judgments, that works. So in medicine, sometimes it's obligatory to get a second opinion for certain kinds of illnesses. And if you have 5 doctors independently agreeing on what the diagnosis is, the chances that group of 5 is going to be comparatively not noisy and probably not less biased also. So aggregating independent judgments is one. The APGAR score writ large is another. Using something between guidelines and rules tends to work really well. If you don't make a holistic judgment based on your intuition, but instead break the judgment down into, let's say, 5 component parts and assess them independently before you make your intuition, that can be extremely helpful as well. These are decision hygiene strategies, and the beauty of them is they're like washing your hands, meaning they help you against a variety of diseases, and you don't have to know which one is in play. For bias, it's a little harder and a little easier both, because you discover, let's say, you are showing the planning fallacy, meaning you're unrealistically optimistic, and you kind of know what to do. There's a debiasing strategy for that. That's easier because you're identifying things. It's harder because the task of identification might be very challenging. There might be a lot of biases in place. Hygiene works without identifying what the culprit is.
Yes, attacking a bias is more like treating a condition, right? You've got this bias, here's the medicine, whereas hygiene is about just kind of preventing the general spread of all of these nasty things. I think it's just a good moment probably to say also that the noise audit probably carries with it a presumption of you looking for the unwanted variation, and to kind of just re-emphasize that point, because there's lots of wanted variation in all kinds of things. Right?
So we define noise as unwanted variability. If you have 3 great friends and one likes some movies and another likes others, That's not unwanted variability. In a meeting, to have varying views about how to handle a problem, that's a good thing. That diversity is a good thing. It's when you want judgments to be identical and they turn out to be dependent on the lottery. That is unwanted.
Yeah, so I think that's why every word in that definition does quite a bit of work. You might have wanted variation in professional judgments. You might have unwanted variation in non-professional judgments. Like maybe there's only so much variation that you and your wife can have in how you think about your friends before it's hard to go away on vacation.
Right. Think of a prediction where you have someone saying the economy is going to boom and someone else saying it's going to bust. And that the judgment about policy is dependent on which one you happen to draw. That would be very bad.
Yeah.
If you have inputs into the decision, which are differences in judgment as an input into how people are going to think about it, that's not unwanted. That's part of the deliberative process. But if whether you act as if the economy is going to boom or bust depends on the lottery of who happens to be in charge that week, that would not be good.
That's why noise rather than sound, which would be a neutral term, or even music, which would be a positive term, people don't sit listening to the variation in all the sounds coming out of the musical instruments at a concert and say, oh, what's that noise? Well, I guess depending on whether you like the music or not, you might, but it's the difference between noise and sound.
Think of it as a noisy scale is not a good scale. A scale whose weight they show you as being depends on the day. That you've got to fix that scale. And the mind is a measuring instrument. And often we have to fix that scale.
Yeah. To be clear, my weighing scale is always biased and always says I'm heavier than I must be. Yeah, I have the same only explanation. It's true, isn't it? It's amazing. They all seem to be biased that way.
Yeah, mine is the same. I think it's a conspiracy or something.
They must manufacture them that way. So I want to talk just at the end, a small bone maybe to pick with you. We're both big fans of John Stuart Mill, and the arguments that you make in favor of libertarian paternalism, particularly as you outlined with Dick Thaler in Nudge, but in a lot of your work. And in fact, the book, I think, where you spend most time on this is Why Nudge, which is based on one of your lectures. And this idea of autonomy. And I guess the bone, I'll pick the bone, and then this might open up a bit of a conversation, which is you make the argument that Mill's harm principle is that if I'm only hurting myself, I should be left alone, right? And the reason for that is because I know what's best for me. You say that's the epistemic argument, right? And you say, well, that's not true. It turns out that Mill couldn't have known this, but we've done all this work, and we now know that I don't know what's best for me, or at least I'm lousy at getting it. So Mill was just wrong in his kind of estimation. And the small bone, and then it is just, I think Mill did know that. I mean, Mill wrote in Utilitarianism that men often from infirmity of character make their election for the nearer good, though they know it to be the less valuable, right? So he, like, I think everybody since the beginning of time knows that we don't always make those choices in the right way. And the reason I think he focuses on autonomy as the solution, or noble character, to use his language, is he thinks the solution is to make ourselves better, is to become more skilled. And he's hopeful that we will become more skilled. Whereas I think your view, and I'll caricature it probably, your view is more, these are just fixed, right? We're not going to get better at this. We're always going to be short term and so on. And so we're just going to have to put these nudges in place or policies in place. And so the difference is that Mill's more optimistic, that we can all become more noble in character.
So maybe you're raising great questions. So Mill On Liberty says that the reason for the harm principle is that outsiders can't know as much as choosers do. And that's his epistemic claim on behalf of the harm principle. Mill didn't fail to know that human beings are fallible. He was making a comparative judgment about outsiders versus choosers. And there's a lot of truth to what he's saying, but it's not as global a empirical truth as he described it as. So I know what kind of ice cream I like better than I think anyone on the planet, but I don't know what healthcare plan I should have better than anyone on the planet. And I don't know how best to handle, let's say, a disease I'm going to get in the next 10 years better than anyone on the planet. I know some relevant things about my tastes, but about treatments, I don't. I don't know how to navigate, let's say, the airport in Saudi Arabia, where I've never been, better than others. In fact, I'm quite sure I don't know very well, so some nudges are good. The idea that we should improve people rather than nudge them is often true, but as a policy prescription, it's, what's the right word, incalculably coarse. So a GPS device is a good idea. Allergy warnings on certain packages, that's a good idea. To give people signage at airports such that they can figure out where to go, that's a good idea. Rather than telling people, before you take your trip, learn how to figure out where to go in the airport. There's a discussion to be had about whether automatic enrollment in savings plans or free meal plans for kids is a good idea. But it's not self-evident that the right idea is to give people, at what time in their lives, a course in financial planning or a course in whether your kid should be in school meals. So it's emphatically true that improving people's capacities is often the best approach. But to use that as an argument against nudging is, I'm not even sure what the words are. You want to abolish the GPS device?
No, you're right. The navigability point, I think, is well made. And actually, the default retirement one is quite close to home because I was serving in the Cameron-Clegg government that really moved forward on that and helped set up the behavioral insights team. And there's a conversation internally. There's a sort of standing joke because I was working for Nick Clegg, which is that people would say, what would John Stuart Mill say? Is this liberal? And this came up in the context of the default environments. And my boss, Nick Clegg, was what I would describe as a good pragmatic liberal, like liberal to his bones, but also not willing to die in a ditch over small stuff. And there was opt-out. So you change the default and so on. And again, I think it's a difference between a sort of libertarian who would be like, this is an outrageous infringement on, and a liberal who says, okay, there are different values at stake here. How do we land on it? Does this protect freedom enough, etc.? Then you've made this argument too about seatbelt rules too. I think that's a really good answer. I think what happens in this conversation is that the extent to which Mill and those like him was talking about autonomy rather than liberty is quite important. And actually, although it's called on liberty, whenever he tended to use the word autonomy a lot, especially in French more generally. And I think that's more consistent with what he's talking about, this idea of learning to self-govern. That's why he was very in favor of local government and so on too, as opposed to this sort of space of liberty, like leave me alone. It was more the vision of the individual here is of one who has become more skillful, more self-governing, better able to overcome these present biases and so on, more skilled in the world. And that's actually what he means in the end by utility. It's why he's a bad utilitarian, because in the end for him, it's not welfare and it's not social welfare, which are a couple of the moves you can make. It is this sense to which the individual is able to become more of their own GPS. It doesn't mean you don't want a GPS or signs and so on, but the balance between how much of this is from me and how much is having to be done for me is just somewhat more. And he would see progress as being individuals being able to do more of these things themselves, not know their way around an airport, but be better at saving, be better at managing, then just a bit to be better, crudely.
Well, I agree with that. Broadly speaking, that seems to me completely right. But let's say people are buying appliances or motor vehicles, and the question is whether they should be nudged to buy ones that would save the money, let's say, because they're more energy efficient or fuel efficient. And let's say the nudge would take the form of information disclosure that tells them how much money they'd save if they got an energy efficient refrigerator rather than one not. Now, that both improves their capacity for agency and nudges them. I hope Mill wouldn't have an objection to that.
Right.
Let's suppose that workers are entering jobs where they could be given a lot of information about statistical risks, both probabilities and outcomes, or whether the workforce could be subject to, let's say, some clearly cost-benefit justified regulation, which would reduce the risk of death by a magnitude that crushes the cost of the risk reduction. That would be not a nudge, but it would be, let's say, on plausible assumptions of behaviorally informed intervention, counteracting both absence of information and present bias. It would seem to me theological, not in a good way, to rule that out of bounds on the ground that workers should be given risk education with respect to silica and silicosis.
Cass, I think those are all great points. Perhaps I can invite you back on at some point to have a longer conversation about this. And I think one of the reasons I'm wanting to have this discussion is because I think that this is not from you, but I'm seeing from some conservatives a sort of straw man version of Mill, where they impute to him a less sophisticated view than the one that you just shared, which is that he thought that people were all knowing and that consumer sovereignty was great and so on. And because that's clearly not true, liberalism fails. So they take Mill, say, they straw man Mill, knock him down, and then say that's why Patrick Deneen does this in Why Liberalism Failed.
No, I agree with that. So the descriptions of liberalism by Patrick Deneen and others are wild. It's as if there's a construction of something and then a series of exclamations of horror. And engagement with the liberal tradition itself, let's say, gives a much more, what's the right word, inspiring picture of the conception of our species than the critics offer.
Well, thank you for saying that. We could agree on that. And you can perhaps, when you next speak to President Obama, you can tell him that when he recommended Patrick Deneen's book, well, saying he disagreed with much of it, but nonetheless recommended it in 2018, that was a low point for many of us. And so if you could ask him not to do that again, that would be much appreciated. But this has been great, Cass. I'm so grateful to you for your time, for coming on. We've scratched the surface of some of these issues at the end, but spent a lot of time on this really impressive new book that you've worked on with this great trio of writers. There's much in there to ponder on, and actually, I think, to use as well. And I think that's why the collaboration worked out so well. It's something that even just as someone in an institution myself, I'm going to be taking that back and talking to my bosses at Brookings and thinking, we should think about where our noise is and where do we want it to be, and maybe do an audit. So it has the rare gift of a book that's both very, very deep, but also strongly applied. So you and your co-authors are going to make this job.
That's an honor. The number of hours spent on the book is really, really high. So if it turned out okay, that's a great honor.
I think it's going to make a lot of noise, but in a good way this time. So Cass, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you. Great pleasure. Great to see you.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.